All right. So as many of you are aware, there was a DSA convention a few weeks ago that really, I think in some ways, crystallized the debate, tension, happy disagreements that have been happening on the left in the post-Bernie 2020 era about how the left broadly should proceed, how the Democratic Socialists of America specifically should proceed, whether or not various high-profile members of the DSA are actually good avatars for the movement, et cetera. And I'm so glad, one, to have had that event, generally speaking, and two, to have two people who represent kind of different sides of that argument join on Bad Faith today to kind of flesh out both what happened there at the convention and what the kind of internal conversations to DSA are. Because I do think there's a perception that, DSA thinks one thing, whereas Socialist Alternative will think another thing, and that there is a kind of uniformity of belief within DSA. I, until recently, was a DSA member. I know that many people are both DSA and Socialist Alternative, and I think it's much more productive than kind of flinging around claims of entryism and the like. Just sit down with folks to have a good faith conversation about what this is all about. So without further ado, we have Philip Locker, who is with the Reform and Revolution Caucus, which you can find at reformandrevolution.org. Correct, Philip?
That's right.
Okay, correct. And it was also a delegate at the National Convention. Welcome, Philip.
Great to be on.
We also have Stylianos Scott Cardolis, who is an organizer and member with what he, I think, a little tongue-in-cheek described as the right-wing side of this debate here with New York DSA. He was also a delegate at the convention and is a podcaster with a left podcast called Left on Red. Adorable name, love a pun. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Bree. I'm happy to be here. And it's Karolides.
Oh, Karolides. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I
You're
wasted
so
much
good.
time figuring out the first name. I completely butchered the last name. Karolides. Scott Karolides. Okay. All right. Who should we have up first? Okay. How about we start with easy ground? Can you guys just kind of walk me through the nature of the conventions, what the big ticket items were to be decided at the convention, how frequently DSA meets, and kind of walk me through a sense of what the leadership structure is like for those of us who've never been especially involved in the organization?
Well, I think that's one of the really wonderful, really precious things about DSA is that it's a democratic member-run organization where it's really, unfortunately, very rare on the left and in U.S. society that you have such a formation like that. If you compare it to like our revolution or the Bernie Sanders campaign, things are just decided top down, and people are volunteers, but they're not democratic members who control and run the organization. With DSA, it's a bottom-up democratic organization. So every 2 years, we have a national convention where every chapter, there's, I think, somewhere between 200 and 230 chapters across the country, elect delegates. From Seattle, we elected 26 delegates. There's many more in New York. I don't know how many. There's months of discussion and debate. We come together at a national convention. The last one was 2 years ago, the summer of 2021. This just happened at the beginning of August in Chicago. We had about 1,000 delegates. And at the convention, we discussed what the delegates get to decide. There was a debate about the agenda. Myself and my caucus, we were part of an effort to amend the agenda, which we succeeded. 53% of the delegates said the agenda that had been proposed was missing some important items. We can get into that. Mm-hmm. So there's a democratic debate about that, even what's the priorities to discuss. And then we elect a national political committee, which is the empowered by the convention to run DSA as a national organization between now and the next convention 2 years from now.
Okay. And so maybe we should just get right into it. You mentioned that there was already some debate about what the agenda was going to be. What were the most controversial items that had been left off?
That's a good question.
I mean, it's a lot. It's hard to manage. You have 1,000 delegates, and you only have 3 days, and everyone has
Hmm.
competing priorities. So, I mean, speaking for I felt even with the amendment, we moved an amendment where we successfully added three things back onto the agenda um, that were more. They were having a nationwide campaign for trans and reproductive rights, a resolution for a party-like electoral strategy, and a resolution about DSA's relationship with and stance on anti-Zionism. Those were three controversial things that were originally not proposed to be on the agenda. They were added back on. There were other things which I think were very unfortunately left out, but which was like there was a resolution that I also co-authored on DSA should not endorse Joe Biden and
Hmm.
establish a certain direction for our approach towards the 2024 elections. Unfortunately, that wasn't on the agenda. There was a resolution also on the war in Ukraine that unfortunately didn't make the agenda. I'm sure Scott has other things that maybe he was unhappy weren't on the agenda, but that was sort of what he that was sort of the general picture.
Yeah, the process with what gets on the agenda, even in an organization like DSA, is political and controversial itself. I think about 3 or 4 months in advance of convention, folks get together to start making resolutions, proposals, constitutional amendments, basically putting together what they believe should happen at convention. And anybody can do this. Me, Philip, Bree, if you are still in DSA, and we hope you come back, you as a
My dues
member.
just lapsed. It wasn't purposeful. I just forgot.
At the end of this, we need it. That's our goal. Get Bree to re-up her dues. But so any member whose dues paying has an opportunity to get involved, write a proposal. And so there were probably dozens of those. In advance of convention, everyone that had been elected delegate, which was decided at the chapter level based on whatever voting system they used, then gets an email from this convention planning committee, which is made up of lots of political tendencies in TSA and I believe run by the NPC, the National Political Committee. And we basically voted and ranked on what we supported, what we didn't support, what we wanted to see on the agenda, what we didn't want to see on the agenda. And then also something called a consent agenda. Because there's dozens of proposals, we kind of try and pack everything into one neat package in the beginning and say, this is the consent agenda. More than 80% of members coming today probably support this, and we're going to pass these all at once so we can talk and debate about the more controversial or meaty items. And that's how the original agenda was decided and then was amended before we begun convention.
So I'm kind of surprised, first and foremost, that there wasn't an appetite for the resolution about whether or not to endorse Joe Biden, or was it just that there was already so much consensus that obviously we shouldn't endorse Joe Biden, that it wasn't worth putting on the agenda? Can you tell me a little bit more about what was going on with that, Philip?
I think there is a consensus in DSA that DSA should not endorse Joe Biden, but that wasn't voted on. That's an opinion. That's not to be that wasn't tested. But I think it's uncomfortable, and Scott can speak more about that. But I think the wing, maybe that Scott can represent, I think it was an uncomfortable resolution for them because it's one thing. I think it's known that if there was a vote, DSA would say we're not endorsing Joe Biden.
And then the implications for all of the DSA electeds would be.
The more controversial part about our resolution said that the convention also formally would request that DSA electeds respect and advocate the DSA position, which would be not to endorse Joe Biden, to back up, to be 100% against Trump and the Republican right, to be part of building mass movements in the streets and independent working class mobilization against the Republican right. But that we also see Biden as a big business and representative, and we're not endorsing him. And then it said our elected representatives should also put forward that position. And then we should have a further discussion and debate in DSA in the next few months with a Democratic membership vote to decide if there's anyone we do want to endorse. But that would have put the DSA members in Congress in an uncomfortable position. So I'm reading into it. This wasn't said explicitly, but I think forces that wanted a more friendly relationship or want to avoid conflicts with the DSA electeds felt uncomfortable with that resolution.
So Scott, what's your angle in all of this? Is it really about tension over whether or not it's worth it to upset the apple cart, as it were, to upset the relationship with electeds like AOC and Ilhan Omar and the rest of the squad?
I think this gets to maybe not a topic as resolution, but just a bigger subject that was a huge source of debate at convention, which isn't, whether or not we want to punish people for an endorsement or whether or not we want to suggest one thing or the other, but what does it mean for DSA to be a party? I probably would not have voted for this resolution, in part because, like Philip says, I believe, one, there's broad consensus. I don't think anyone thinks the organization should endorse Joe Biden, besides maybe 10% of membership. And then two, I agree, I don't like the word relationship because it implies kind of this interpersonal play, but I don't want our party to kind of come into our federal electeds, who I hope to become members of a Socialist in Office Committee, and I'm so excited to talk about that. But I would hope that our party management becomes one that's a lot more collaborative, that instead of coming to a convention and making a vote where we haven't coordinated or worked with our federal Socialists in Office at all in advance, and then telling them, by the way, this thing you did, you have to undo it. Instead, I would have loved for, and I'm pushing to create this along with some other comrades, for there to be this high-level committee made up of democratically elected representative membership, in part the NPC as well has an obvious role to play in this, to have regular meetings with our federal electeds and be working with them in advance on a strategy so that we can talk to AOC months before she goes on a podcast and makes an endorsement of Joe Biden and say, hey, what are you thinking about this? Who's pressuring you to do this? We want to pressure you not to do this. What do you need not to do this? Do we need to show up in your district and say people do not want you to endorse Joe Biden? Do we need to create an alternative that's a lot more palatable for you to support? And we know there's an avenue there. I think a lot of people know that AOC was extremely unhappy with Joe Biden, especially in wake of the decision last year in the Supreme Court that overturned Roe. And so we know there are opportunities with her, but we never explored them. We don't have that committee with her right now.
Tell me more about that, because you said there's opportunities, and I do think that the feeling is, and maybe this is an incorrect feeling, and I'd love you to push back on it if you have some evidence to the contrary, but the feeling is on the, I'll call myself part of the podcast left, is that the behavior of some of these DSA electeds on the federal level over the course of the last 2 years, 3 years, has made us very skeptical that there are really avenues there, that there is any interest in conferring with DSA to talk to the independent media figures that were so useful to these folks in getting elected in the first place, to put our heads together around any sort of strategy and plan. Ever since, I think, probably the force the vote moment, a lot of folks saw the kind of hostility with which electeds reacted to the plan, the way there was no openness. I was part of a socialist alternative phone tree. Was it a socialist alternative phone tree? Now that I think about it, was it a DSA phone tree? I was part of somebody's phone tree that was calling Congress and trying to get them just to be open to the plan, hear us out, something, anything, over Thanksgiving before Force the Vote, so the Thanksgiving of 2020. And there was absolutely no receptivity to it whatsoever. There was that moment on Sam Cedars' show where he admitted that somebody from some elected official's office had called him and asked that they stop talking about Force the Vote. And all of that stuff together suggested, well, there doesn't really seem to be much openness to having a kind of membership-led relationship with them at all. Not that we were members or represented an organization or anything like that, but that was the only kind of anecdotal evidence we had. So talk to me about this. Do you think that this was genuinely just a timing issue, and that if DSA had brought up this resolution last year, long before any discussion of endorsing anybody, long before AOC had already kind of locked herself in on Pod Save America with that endorsement, that they really genuinely would have been open to that and to opening a more consistent, collaborative, deferential even relationship with the organization that they're a part of?
Absolutely. First off, today we're all members of the podcast left. But I feel so incredibly strongly about this. This is maybe my big bugaboo about convention, which was that, the big issue that we were describing is, what does it mean to be a party? And I think a lot of folks on that I'm aligned with in DSA feel very strongly that we should be a party-like organization. When it comes to our federal electeds, usually I'm talking about what happens here in New York State, because this is where I organize. I do stuff in New York City, New York State, and we have something called the Socialist in Office Committee. And that's where every week, 9 a.m., all the New York State level electeds that we have, so Zakran, Marcella, Emily, Julia, Sarhana, I won't name them all, meet with New York State elected members of DSA, usually just representative of the areas they're elected in. So the New York City folks, Mid-Hudson Valley DSA folks, and other members that are elected by branches, by priority campaigns. And there's this very intensely collaborative space. And some days I'm really shocked that these elected officials come and meet with us every single week in the morning, and we discuss and we debate, and there's a lot of tension. It's not perfect. But that kind of structure, I think, would work really well at the federal level. I can't say too much.
These are not meetings these are all, you're discussing meetings with state level people.
Yeah.
It's not like
yet federal.
Okay. So then my question is, you have a model for it. Does the fact that it hasn't yet happened with any of the federal electeds suggest to you a lack of interest on their part? I mean, has DSA, I presume that there's been outreach and attempts to do exactly this at some point over the last few years, and evidently it hasn't happened, right?
There's not a lot I can share, but a couple of weeks before convention, I was aware that my Congress member was very interested in making a Socialist in Office committee happen with DSA. And in some part, and we can get into that, the previous NPC, which was divided in many ways, sometimes dropped the ball on moving those meetings forward. And there were varying points of interest. You're a
Congress member. Scott, where do you live? Are you a Jamal
I'm in
Bowman
Astoria.
New Yorker?
I'm in Astoria.
You're an AOC New Yorker?
I'm in the People's Republic of Astoria, and that is Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's definitely very interested, and I believe folks are working to put it together right now. But basically, they're very interested, and this actually came up in the context of the rail vote, not the Biden endorsement, but essentially what we were hearing from them was DSA didn't do any outreach with us, didn't have any collaboration, didn't say in advance, this is how we want you to vote. And this is like my big theory around elected officials in the United States. We have a very liberal individualist system where we get people elected, we give them an incredible amount of power, we send them essentially into the lion's den, and then we kind of expect them to be perfect avatars and do everything really well, and that's it. And the reality is they're getting an incredible amount of pressure from leadership, from Nancy Pelosi or now Hakeem Jeffries or Chuck Schumer, and all of their colleagues who are bearing down on them 24/7. Don't do this. Don't act this way. Do this instead. And that's partially why you've seen a lot of them move from, really positive positions when they first got elected, slowly becoming a little bit more hard to stick to that radical outsider energy. What we need to do is create the DSA counterbalance. There needs to be party leadership in our end, going to Cori Bush and AOC and Rashida Tlaib, our three SIOs at the national level, and giving them resources, telling them in advance, this vote is going to come up, this is the information, these are the unions involved, these are the rank and file caucuses, here's 5 people for you to talk to, here's this information, this is how we want you to vote. And then preparing them, you're going to get a ton of backlash for this, here's your base that's ready to activate and support you, so that actually Hakeem Jeffries looks really bad when a multiracial working class base comes out. When we only react with statements or frustration, especially publicly after the fact, we reveal weakness, we reveal an inability to organize at that party level, we don't have that kind of structure, and we're kind of sending this message, we're not going to back you up when you need us, we're not going to support you in making the right decision, and then when you fail, we're going to get really upset. Okay. And I think it's really critical. We want to be a party.
Philip, what do you say to that? Are they ready and waiting to work with the podcast left, the DSA's druthers? It's only that we haven't reached out enough. The DSA hasn't reached out enough in advance in all of these years, and there's maybe been some leadership void in establishing those lines of communication.
I agree a lot with what Scott is saying. I'm not sure I share the same conclusion, but I agree. I think we share a lot of, I completely agree we need, and the resolution that we did get on the agenda towards a party-like electoral strategy did say exactly what Scott is talking about, that we need a federal socialist in office committee, a congressional Democratic and that we should set up a congressional Democratic Socialist Caucus separate from the Progressive Caucus that's made up of the DSA electeds in Congress and representatives from our national leadership. And it is, in my opinion, a huge failure of the previous leadership that wasn't done. That we need to have those discussions in advance. It can't just be condemnation after there's problems. I 100% agree. We need to back them up. We need to give them support. We need to understand there's huge pressure on socialists when they're elected into these fundamentally capitalist institutions. But I also, I also agree we need to be clear what our expectations are up front. And that was part of the resolution towards a party-like electoral strategy was the mandate that those things actually happen now. But also it established certain clear red lines based on our painful experience of the last 2 years that going forward, there can be no ambiguity. We can be completely clear. What do we expect from electeds? Because there was this argument made with the railway vote that Scott talked about. Well, they didn't know how we wanted them to vote on. So we put forward a resolution that said, well, two things. One, towards a party-like electoral strategy, it had red lines saying, not like a comprehensive program, but 4 elementary socialist principles that we say every elected socialist must respect, which is number 1, you do not vote to ban workers from going on strike. Number 2, that we do not increase funding or strengthen the repressive forces of the racist police. Number 3, that we do not fund the U.S. war machine or funding for U.S. proxy states like the state of Israel, and that we never vote in favor of discriminatory, oppressive legislation. Those were 4 basic principles that we want to establish as red lines going forward, not talking about the past, but going forward. And then also making it clear as an organization democratically, do we want our electeds to endorse Joe Biden or not? Not everyone has. AOC, just before the convention did, we put that resolution forward before she made her endorsement. It wasn't responding to her. The others haven't made endorsements yet. Let's democratically make our voice heard so that the electeds know what we want them to do. But unfortunately, that was not passed. There was 59% of the convention said, no, we don't want to do that, which I think reflects the state of where DSA and the radical left is at, that there's sort of a deference towards electeds and a fear of upsetting the apple cart and a fear of losing influence.
Yeah, I mean, based on those red line items, Philip, I know it's prospective and not retrospective, but it seems like everybody fails at least one prong of that test. Maybe Rashida Tlaib slips through. I'd have to review, if she voted for increased military budget or if she voted for the post 1/6 cop funding. But I mean, I hear what you're saying about, well, if we establish these standards instead of using them as a cudgel to punish past behavior, there would be openness among these individuals to follow the lead of the organization and be compliant. But I guess I am a little bit skeptical because I have a harder time believing that they don't know how the membership wants them to vote, even if it hasn't been formalized. Because again, I know it's imprecise, and I'm not saying that the podcast left represents the interest of DSA or what have you, but there was just so much frustration and so much anger in the lead up to the rail vote, in the lead up to it, not just after the fact, in the lead up. There was so much anger and there was so much frustration and there was so much good faith open pleading prior to force the vote, right? Like we weren't antagonistic at that time. It was like, please, let's try this. And then we felt like we were met with antagonism. And then similarly, we had all these little mini force the vote moments over the course of 2021 with the bifurcation. I think a lot of us were very pleased when AOC first said she was going to hold the line on bifurcating the Build Back Better bill. And I saw a lot of people who were critical of her in other instances praise her and say, good job, let's see if this sticks. Some people were skeptical that she was going to really hold the line, but they were hopeful that she would. I don't think there was any ambiguity about what the left broadly, including the DSA left, wanted out of that moment. And then it didn't happen. And when there are these moments, whether it's the Iron Dome vote, there is this desire, I think, among many of us that even if you feel bullied, even if Nancy Pelosi said, I've got your grandma in a cave with a red dot on her head unless you vote the way I want, like at least tell us, right? And we might maybe not even hold it against you, but at least tell us what you're up against so we can we can assure you that we have your back to the extent that we have any power to push back against that sort of a thing, right?
Right. I think the fundamental thing here, I think DSA has made mistakes and needs to get its get its house in order to better be in a better position to support and make sure these things don't happen. But I think that's secondary. I think the fundamental thing is political, that since Biden and the Democrats were elected and took power starting at the beginning of 2021, the DSA electeds have been under an intense pressure with the Democrats in power to act less as a militant opposition and more as a loyal opposition. And they've shifted from the stance they had when they were initially elected in 2018 as sort of a militant opposition to more and more of a loyal opposition, which has been a step towards incorporating them into the Democratic Party.
Let me ask you this, Philip. I understand that they are under pressure. I don't understand why they are susceptible to that pressure, because DSA is not AOC. AOC, at the end of the day, it's her job. And there are obvious ways that the Democratic Party can hurt AOC. But for the DSA losing out on some spokespeople that have been good for the brand, as it were, why is it that DSA, which is supposed to be the largest and premier socialist organization in the United States of America, who understands the power structures at play here and understands the corrupting influence of politics and is outside of politics for that very reason, in part, why is there any influence at all on DSA for what Hakeem Jeffries tells to AOC or what Nancy Pelosi says to Ilhan Omar?
I don't understand your question so well. Sorry. As in,
Philip is articulating the idea that the DSA leadership has been under pressure since Biden was elected to be supportive of the Democratic Party and not be an adversarial organization. And I
think
understand.
He meant the electeds.
Yes. I was thinking about the electeds.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. Sorry. All right. Fair enough. So then my question is this. Even there has been not a single moment, as far as I can tell, but let me know if I've missed something, where when the electeds do start to flag and be susceptible to the kind of influence you're describing, there have been very few moments where there has been a tension, like an open fissure between DSA as an organization and those electeds. And only recently have we been having these conversations about, there was the challenge, the effort to potentially kick Jamal Bowman out. There was this more recent incident with the Massachusetts, who was it?
Some state legislator in
some
Massachusetts.
state, Mike Connolly. Well, yeah, Mike Connolly, who there was a petition to expel him for various reasons. But this is now 3 years into the Biden administration. And I guess my question is, to the extent that you can talk about it, like, have there been any internal conversations about whether or not the organization was going to make an effort to be critical of openly some of the choices that have been made of these electeds?
I think there have been a ton of conversations. I mean, obviously, as you alluded to, last year, Jamal Bowman was unendorsed by the organization, and there was an incredible amount of internal conflict over that. And this year, after the rail vote, DSA nationally released a statement explaining our position is very different from the position of the federal electeds. And I think that tension exists every single day. If you're asking, why are we so reluctant sometimes to be so viciously critical? Well, I mean, I can say...
Vicious isn't a word that I would use. I would just say honestly critical.
I would say, one, DSA, as we said in the beginning, is a very, very diverse group of people with lots of different opinions. And so there's, it's tough for us to figure out our internal position on things at times. But two, when it comes to AOC and Rashida Tlaib and Cori Bush, those are our three nationally endorsed socialists in office, electeds. I think they remain incredibly potent spokespeople. And we have to, from my perspective at least, AOC brought me into this organization, right? She speaks really potently to a lot of working class people like myself. She made an incredible amount of sense to me. She's the reason I joined DSA. And this is not to say I have a personal allegiance to her or I want to defend her specifically.
She's the reason I joined as well in 2018.
So what I'm trying to say here is there is that interpersonal desire sometimes when we get frustrated and disappointed with their votes, and really we should be a lot more critical. And I really do believe that we should be a party that has that committee that's talking with them and criticizing them directly and preventing these things from happening. But then even so publicly, the random person on the street sees AOC and says, oh, that's a radical socialist. And some people see her and like, that's a radical socialist, and I think I like that. And then a lot of people see her and say, no, I don't think I like that. But she remains this incredible resource, this tool for the organization. And we can't get stuck into, well, she has individually made a ton of bad votes and it's time to cut her loose. But what are the structures that DSA has that can help rein her in, help pull her into better votes? What are ways we can use this person who obviously is an incredible communicator, has an incredible following online? How can we use her to broaden and expand the socialist left? Because we're not at the size,
DSA,
at the demographics that we need right now.
But there's a membership crisis, no? The membership is declining.
I think membership is declining in large part because we had those really big bumps. And like yourself, a lot of people lapsed. I don't think it's not at all a political issue, but in fact, many people lapsed membership and didn't get emails or outreach to sign back up. And we get a lot of members from news bumps, external events, and we are suffering the same way as every other left or liberal left or anything further left of Biden is suffering right now under Joe Biden, the way that we were flourishing under Trump. It's a really difficult environment. And I can tell you, I go to, I help run these DSA 101, these like new introductory member meetings. And the folks that come there, 30 to 40 people a month, and they're very diverse. It's usually 50% women, which you don't see at a DSA meeting. And lots of folks that are not white, folks that are of all different ages, come from so many different backgrounds. And they're interested and they come to us from so many different things. Oh, I heard about Build Public Renewables. I heard about the taxi driver thing that you guys did. I know these electeds you have. And they're interested in joining, but we don't always make that snap into, okay, great. Are you going to pay dues tomorrow? There is a political issue. And part of it is we have a very apathetic political society. We have one that now that Trump isn't in office, people don't feel that same drive that they used to. And people do say, oh, maybe things are okay under
all right,
Biden.
Scott. But I just had this conversation with Dan Marins over at Huffington Post, who was writing about this issue with Justice Democrats, how they can't raise any money anymore, similar decline. And you could attribute it to all the things we just attributed it to. But part of my pushback to him and a critique that he included in his article as a kind of a secondary explanation is that the confidence that people had in these figures that had the ability to draw so many people into the organization is lapsed. When I said at the beginning of this episode that the only reason my DSA membership is lapsed is because I forgot to pay my dues, that's half true. But I would have renewed it in all likelihood, because it's not a big deal to open your computer and just click your credit card, which is automatically remembered by my computer, and just renew it, if I was feeling positively about the DSA the way that I used to. But at this point, the inertia of paying was enough to keep me in. But now to renew feels like an affirmative support of an organization that I am, in all honesty, feeling ambivalent about, because it is represented by people like AOC who have made all of these decisions that I feel frustrated by over the course of the last few years. Do you know what I'm saying? And so, Philip, I wonder, how much do you attribute some of the membership decline to, we're in a post-Bernie era and people just aren't into it anymore? Because I would note that the membership spike happened in 2018 after Bernie lost. 2 years after Bernie lost, you had the spike. And now we're sitting 2 years after Bernie lost the second time, 3 years after Bernie lost, and we're having the opposite situation.
I think it's a combination of, there is a change in the objective situations after Trump was kicked out and the Democrats took office. There's been a decline. It's not just DSA. As you mentioned, Justice Democrats, BLM, there's been a decline in social movements and struggle and activism with Biden and the Democrats in power. I would say that's something we need to be mindful. That's a key role that the Democrats play, is demobilizing and social movements are weaker while they're in power. We need to be
Democrats, including squad members? Because that's the argument, right? The argument that's being made by the, let's call it, and I mean this in not a disrespectful way, but in a kind of descriptive way, let's call it the Jimmy Dore left. The argument on the Jimmy Dore left is that...
Yeah, but I think they're completely unbalanced.
But wait a minute. Let me just because there's a critique here that I think is legitimate. But this is a critique I think is legitimate. It's that when you talk about people who are losing faith in the Democratic Party, losing faith in the power of elections and all of that sort of thing, when you have, the argument is that AOC and the squad members were willing to be adversarial and loud when Trump came in. That's kind of what you're saying. Well, it was circumstantially different because Trump was in office and there was a greater sense of urgency. The critique is that a socialist member of Congress should feel almost or as adversarial to these corporate Democrats as they are to Donald Trump. But instead, they are succumbing to the pressure to get along and play nice with people like Hakeem Jeffries, take photo ops with him when the right-wingers are doing exactly what the squad should have been doing back in 2001 by many of our estimation. And that they're, in doing that sort of thing, they are doing the work of sheep herding people into the Democratic Party and creating confidence in the Democratic Party when their whole objective in office should be to hurt them, should be to advance a left agenda, not to enable a corporate Democrat agenda.
Absolutely. I definitely think socialists need to have an adversarial, oppositional attitude. We should be clear the Democratic Party right now is running the country in the interests of corporate America, not working people. And our job is to build a left-wing working class opposition. That's not the approach that AOC and the squad has taken. And I think that needs to be criticized. Where I think Jimmy Dore, as the most sort of silly caricature version of the podcast left, completely loses any sense of proportion, is thinking that is not seeing the point that Scott made, which is absolutely true, that we also have to have a sense of proportion, that AOC and Cori Bush and Rashida Tlaib are still the most left-wing members of Congress. They're still a point of reference to tens of thousands of people who are being radicalized, and they're still on the whole plane.
But to who, Philip? Because
this is a lot more than the Jimmy Dore left.
Well, I'm really not trying to be that person, Philip, but we're talking here in the midst of a membership decline. So this argument that the fact of these people being visible and out there is leading all these people to the DSA, I fully believe it's leading a lot of people to give to the Democratic Party. I fully believe that AOC is one of the biggest fundraisers in the Democratic Party. I see comments all the time online and under videos. I love AOC. She's so poised. She's so articulate. She's beautiful. I want to be like her. And I see value in that sort of a thing. But I see value for the Democratic Party much more than I'm seeing value for the left, because I'm not seeing them say, I'm going to go be a socialist. I'm going to go join DSA. I'm going to go vote green. I'm going to be adversarial to the corporate Democrats.
I don't agree with that. I think the direction she's been going in, I don't agree with. I think rather than representing DSA and the needs of the working class and socialist movement, she's been more and more being brought in to the Democratic Party. And I want DSA to try to challenge that. I also think for the left to be effective, the world is more complicated than just black and white, friends and enemies. And there's shades of gray, and that we do need some nuance. I don't agree. I don't like the direction AOC is going in, but to say there's no difference between AOC and Pramila Jayapal and Joe Biden, that's not based in reality. And there can be unions I support, and union leaders sometimes make mistakes, right? That we should criticize. It doesn't make them just bad organizations. That's part of, I think, building an effective left, unlike, I think, a criticism I'd have of the podcast left, too often puts things in these caricatures of either all good or all bad. And I think reality is not so black and white.
Do you have any sense? Go ahead, Scott.
I just want to say, I like, Philip, your mention of unions, because I think unions are the best analogy here. I think we would all agree that most union leadership in the United States right now is fairly conservative, is not democratic, is not really serving the interests of the working class. Yet, we have this huge movement in the United States, the rank and file strategy, to try to reform these unions and bring them over, because we recognize their incredible membership rolls, incredible amounts of money, incredible power. And I want to apply that same analogy to AOC. I think we all started this conversation agreeing that she has, in fact, begun succumbing in many ways to pressures. And I would argue the different details of all the things that she's done with DSA in New York that have been really huge and visible and brought people in. Yes. But that aside,
the taxi stuff, there's been some good, really good stuff.
NRG, build public renewables, tax the rich, so many good things. But the number one thing we need to keep sight of is we can't spend too much time worrying about her as an individual. We must be interested in her as a force multiplier. If she is succumbing in many ways to the Democratic Party, which I think we've all agreed the pressure is there and she's going into it, it is our responsibility not to say, well, she's faithless and she's not bringing people in anymore, we've got to drop her, but to say, we've got to bring her back. All of those things that brought people in from the beginning, that's now our opportunity to get this amazing communicator on our side, and which she already is, but as a visible representative of the party
this
to
is
bring
what's
people
difficult,
in.
Scott. Like, we can't test it. You're telling me that it's not AOC's fault that she hasn't been in dialogue with the DSA and such. It's the DSA leadership has been irresponsible, negligent, what have you, in establishing these means of communication. And then we just got to give her another year, give it another cycle, give it another shot. And maybe once these changes have been made and the doors of communication have been opened, we'll see a different AOC. And then we can see if we can actually pressure and influence her. And then maybe then it will be appropriate to be more sharp in our criticisms of her. And there's no way I can test that. And I hope to God you're right. I hope to whatever you believe in that you're correct. But I also just really want to honor the fact that AOC is neither unintelligent or ignorant. And the feelings that people have been articulating about how they want them to be are obvious. The organization that elected her, Justice Democrats, was founded by two of these members of the podcast left, who have been very much at odds with each other over the course of various points of the last 3 years, but now are very much in agreement, Kyle Kulinski and Cenk Uygur, about her failure to be adversarial. Kyle Kulinski was an avid and vocal supporter of the force the vote moment. He said at the time, this was exactly the kind of thing that we recruited her and ran her to do and be on the right side of. They have each articulated an inability to get in touch with her. They've said all lines of communication have been shut down as they try to get in touch. We've heard similar things from people who were in the first round of her administration. I won't name names, but various people that we know worked for her, who had relationships with people in the Bernie campaign who are now persona non grata. And so there is some skepticism, I got to be honest, that I have at this point. I was not as quick as Jimmy Dore to be as sharp in my criticisms, and I was willing to extend a great deal of latitude. And I'm very happy to be proven wrong going forward. But I also just want to honor the frustrations that people have who feel like they have given her a chance and have been waiting for years now to see a version of AOC that is listening to the left and is willing to listen to the left and is willing to listen to an organization like DSA. And they haven't seen it.
I think that's really valid, and I appreciate you articulating it that, yes, it is very much in the terms of the way people are feeling and what they're seeing. And, I hate to be on the refrain, but yes, it is our response. This is something I've learned in DSA. I've not been in the organization very long, but always understood that politics isn't what you think or what you believe, but it's what you do. And it's not true that it's just AOC's been perfect and DSA just has never reached out to her. Certainly it takes two to tango.
Sure.
But it is incumbent on us to organize these elected representatives. It is incumbent on us to create a party-like structure and use that and wield that, to wield our electeds as powerful resources. And we can't just focus on one or two of them. I regret this conversation has focused so much on.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that too. It always ends up being AOC, but we do know so much about AOC because I got to say, she became the focus of Force the Vote because she said something about it. She put her foot in it when she just got engaged in that Twitter back and forth with Justin Jackson, the NFL player who was a leftist and a Bernie surrogate and a delightful young man who basically asked her, why not do Force the Vote? And the explanation that she gave was really instructive because the reason she gave why she wasn't going to do it were exactly the reasons why she said she was going to vote to impeach Trump, even though it obviously wasn't going to result in his impeachment, result in him being kicked out of office. And so that's why it's about her. It's not that I have a vendetta against her and I'm frustrated with many other people, but she's out there. She's put herself out there. And so now here we are.
I think it's important to take a step back and see, is it rather than it just personalizing it, AOC or Bernie Sanders, that there's clearly, in my view, a structural dynamic at work that when, no matter what your personal intentions are, no matter what your politics are, socialists elected into Congress, into capitalist institutions are going to come under ferocious pressure. I think we all agree about that, from the Democratic Party establishment, but also from class collaborationist union leaders, from the mass media, from confusion in consciousness in the working class base they represent. They're going to come under pressure from all these things. And I think the key thing is to change that. We can get angry about AOC. I think part of change, I think we do need to be honest. I completely agree. We shouldn't cover up and hide and miseducate people when they make mistakes and then build on those mistakes. We need to clarify those things. But I think the key thing is it's not about having like an individual who's going to be great. It's about building. This is why I'm committed to DSA. It's about building a democratic, active rank and file base that has a high enough consciousness that's democratically engaged and that can really bring pressure to bear to hold all of our electeds accountable. The same thing in our unions. Our unions all the time start with really great words, but over time, the general tendency is union leaders start drifting into more and more of a collaborationist approach with the bosses, with management, and adapt the conservative approach. The problem is not this union leader or that union leader. The question is, at the end of the day, we need a really militant, active, empowered, class-conscious rank and file. And that's the project those of us in DSA are trying to build. Is also
let's talk about that, because that circles back around to one of these agenda items, as I understand it, which is the question of whether or not there should be any kind of ideological litmus test to be a member of DSA, which currently there are not. Something that I was very surprised by when post Force the Vote and my frustration, I was looking for alternatives, found Socialist Alternative, opened my checkbook, was about to just sign up and donate and keep it pushing, and discovered that they would not allow me to, and that I had to do like an hour-long class once a week in which I discussed reading for like 2 months before I could join the organization. And, a part of me was like, dag, I don't feel like doing this, of course. But another part of me was like, oh, they have expectations of me, and I certainly could stand to learn a couple of things. And I found it deeply edifying, and frankly, made me really respect my commitment to the organization and participate, at least in the beginning, before they don't have a DC chapter, it's a whole thing. But it made me more invested and more participatory than I ever was in the DSA. And so if you're speaking to this idea that there has to be a heightened consciousness to get the level of organization that's going to be able to affect the change that we want, is having some kind of ideological litmus test for membership required, even if that means that perhaps you have a smaller membership base.
I think we're talking about it a lot. We call it political education, essentially, where we get folks like myself, members of the working class who do not read. And, I should read more. I really should. But who kind of need a little bit of basis in terms of the politics ideology. I think DSA has been really successful so far in terms of being very open tent. And by and large, there are very few people in this organization that probably don't align ideologically. But I agree, when we have new members, and that's part of member development and something we're working on right now, we need to do some political education so that they are far more effective. I don't know what quote it was, but someone told me this quote. It was about my parents, but it was like, starving and illiterate peasants do not make a revolution or whatever. And I was like, yeah, that's true. And so we do, in fact, need to do a lot of education and development for members. I think it's good we don't require people to read in a weekly class. I think it's good that we're kind of very low barrier to membership, but I absolutely support, and I think most people in this organization do, some level of member development. It happens on its own, organically. I would love to find ways to formalize that. And we're exploring that in New York City right now.
When I was reading maybe like a year or so ago, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and I think it was the forward to it. I don't remember who wrote the forward. It was making the point that like there was this belief, he had held the belief until he was reading and writing the forward for this book, that books, pamphlets, whatever, that are written in a certain kind of language were going to be not easily consumed by the masses. And he was very skeptical that the project was going to be of interest. And he had the text lying around his house. And I think he said his child picked it up and read it and loved it. And he was shocked because he figured it was too sophisticated and that, he was skeptical that it was even going to get across. But the ideas were so salient and had such natural purchase from an ideological perspective that his kid got it. And so I'm on the fence about this. I frankly do think that there is an appetite for education in whatever form it comes. If it's videos and not books or whatever, we all have short attention spans these days. I say all the time on the show that I don't like to read and it makes people want to tear their hair out, but I stand by it. Like, I get it. People are busy. There's a lot of streaming services. But like, I also don't think it has to necessarily, I don't think that there is like a disinterest or that there is a lack of capacity or anything like that for people to pick this stuff up. And I think that PragerU and the right really understands this and has been doing this project for a long time. And I understand the desire to have a big organization that you can boast numbers about. But there's something that really resonated with me when people over at Social Alternative were saying we'd rather have a smaller and more engaged base. And they tout that they have been able to achieve more with less. I know I'm sure that's contestable and people have their respective feelings about it, but I do think there's something to that argument about it. So the trade-off between kind of size and potency.
I think you need both. And the key question is the relation, how you tie those two things together. In that there's a need for broad, big tent mass organizations like unions, broad mass movements like BLM, broad organizations like DSA that have a low barrier entry. But you also there's inevitably going to be a minority within all those types of formations, a more activist cadre that's going to be the core of those organizations. And the key is, I think you need both. You need a strong cadre that's politically developed that can, but the question is, a big challenge in socialist politics is that socialist cadre able to integrate itself with a broader mass movement and have roots and influence and educate a broader layer? Or does it end up self-isolating and self-marginalizing and being pure in its isolation and pure in its correctness, but with no connection to a real mass movement? And the key thing that Reform and Revolution is trying to do is stitch those things together, is be rooted in the real movements and mass movements, which have different levels of consciousness, but build an ideologically clear cadre that can help give a Marxist leadership, a principled leadership to those broader efforts.
How? Because I'll tell you, I am Black and relatively prominent on the Bernie campaign. And I was often in the position of feeling like a human shield for a lot of the Bernie bro accusations. At the same time that I went to DSA events and saw the demographic reality that was often presented there. And so, I think I did one event with Jacobin that was in, what's that church on the Upper West Side in Harlem? And we were in the basement of this Harlem Black church. And I think me and one of the other panelists were the only Black people there. So like two and a half of us on the panel were the only Black people there. So I mean, what is to be done? How is DSA on it? Obviously, it's not just Black people, but generally speaking, having a membership that looks more like that's representative of the working class and not like a class at Oberlin.
I'm guilty. I'm an Oberlin grad, so.
Are you really?
Yes.
It's always Oberlin. Sometimes I throw Wesleyan in there. It's just to make fun of a couple of friends of mine. But yeah, how do you change that? What is being done to change that? Rather, I should ask.
I think the key is for the left, and it's not unique to DSA and a lot of the left has to be playing an active role in actually fighting for and leading real struggles that have an impact in the lives of people of color, and demonstrating that these are organizations that in action are on the side of the oppressed and actually have a real value in winning change.
But I don't think that's the hard pitch, because the demographics of people who like supported Bernie, for example, were pretty diverse. We're very diverse. But that's different. I'm sorry?
Demographics.
The demographics. Yeah. But that's a different thing from who comprises DSA membership. And it does feel to me like a recruitment issue. Are you going to go into different kinds of neighborhoods and knock doors in high rises in New York? And I mean, there was this moment on the campaign, I'm sure you remember, because it became a whole story like everything did, where we had that amazing post-heart attack Queens rally under the bridge.
The Queensbridge rally, and then there were people accusing us of not putting flyers up in the houses. Yeah,
exactly. And on the campaign, I'll tell you this, I saw this coming. So it was being scheduled very quickly, last minute, in a few days post-heart attack. Everything was changing very quickly. But as soon as we realized it was happening, we were like 3 days out, and I could already see the writing on the wall. At the time, I happened to have been dating a housing attorney who worked with one of the families in that complex. We had talked about it. I knew it was there. I could see how this news story was going to go. The one that ultimately did come out, I think, in Gothamist. And I was like, well, what can we do to beat that off at the pass? Can we make sure that people who are actually living there, and I think what is the largest housing project, and it's got some distinction.
The Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, is in the Western Hemisphere. I was just going to say New York.
No, it's yeah.
Okay, like making sure that people in there know what's happening outside, that we're not getting a bunch of like noise complaints from the real people who live in the area, and that they feel like this is a movement that's their rally. And part of it was just the reality of the advance team being overwhelmed, and it's nobody's like fault really, but I did feel like there was a lack of real commitment to trying to make that a priority. And they were like, well, we don't have permits to enter the building, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, it's New York. Stand there until someone opens the door and go into the building. You know, I remember asking my partner at the time, like, how did you get access to the building? It's like, I just went in the building. It's a huge building. People are coming and going all the time. And so I don't know. I do feel like sometimes, you know, it is a little bit of a prioritization issue. And do people just have anxiety and fear about being in spaces that are different and new to them, which is human and understandable, but ultimately needs to be overcome?
Oh, yeah. I totally agree. You know, we canvass there all the time. It's not hard to get in those buildings. But yeah, I think a little bit, you know, we've got the Multiracial Organizing Committee, which was voted on again as a priority at convention in terms of trying to deal with this problem. But a little bit of what Philip was saying. Yes, we do need to be in every single struggle and making sure that we're visible and that people trust that DSA cares about my issues and is present. But also, I find a lot of it is a little bit of self-selection. A lot of it's org culture. I mentioned earlier those DSA 101 meetings. The people that show up to those meetings are not very white, not very male, right? It's like, it's a lot more representative of the New York City demographic. And there is this barrier that happens where the people that self-select into DSA are usually white, educated young men. And the people that don't self-select, that don't make that second choice, are not. And that might be because, you know, my little motto here is like, we need to be welcoming, inclusive, and enjoyable. And we're not always. You know, even me, I'm a white man, and I don't have an advanced degree, and I've not read a lot of books. And there have been times in DSA where a lot of the Oberlin grads, or I don't know if that's a good school, but like the people that read a lot kind of treat me a little differently, not on purpose. I don't think there's any malice behind it, but it can be a tough organization to be in if you haven't.
I see it, Scott. I don't think it's like on the basis of my educational background, certainly, but I feel patronized and talked down to, but have you read Gramsci crowd? You know, like, you know, have you read your theory crowd? And so I get it. I both appreciate the need for it, but also the unappealing cultural nature of some of that. It's not my vibe. Yeah. I want to be singing whatever our version of Richmond is, with a cute little red kerchief tied around my neck, living my best life at a big sunny event in Queens. I mean, like, if I'm going to be really true to my soul, I want to be having, my mom says in college that they would have Friday fish fries and talk about the revolution. And I want to be eating good food and commiserating with people who are like-minded and doing the things that I already like to do, but with people who share my politics and my ambitions. I'm going to want to go table more if I know I'm going to find people there that I would ordinarily hang out with, and not, but have you listened to that podcast guy?
Yeah.
Have you heard the new season of Blowback? Like, no disrespect. I hear it's a great show.
I would love to invite you to, no pressure, don't have to join and pay right away, but I think we've made incredible strides towards that kind of culture. At the DSA 101, we sing. We open with singing together. People tell me like, oh, you're making it like church. I'm like, yeah, I am.
Church is fun. I'm not religious, but I do like to go with my aunt to church.
The community aspect of it is really attractive. And most Americans, most working class people, we have gone to church. We identify with church. Not talking about church, but that kind of collective community. We're doing so much better about that culturally in New York City, at least. And I think lots of other chapters are approaching it because it's been a tough issue. I think a lot of it is, in fact, cultural. And yeah, we've gotten more diverse, but it's been slow going. we need to find a way to get out of those self-selecting people, which is great. You know, we love white men. Keep joining DSA. But we also
clip that part.
but we also need people who are not white men. And when I say we need you, I'm also saying, yes, it's incumbent on us to make the space welcoming, inclusive, and enjoyable for you.
Yeah,
I don't
will
want
say,
you to join
as someone
and
who
have a bad time.
struggles with even getting diverse guests on the podcast, I will say that I will ask, if I ask 10 people, 5 people in let's say they're half men, half women, 4.5 of the women say no. It is very frustrating to me. I just put a call out on the podcast on the Patreon for suggested female guests, and I'm like only contacting female guests for the rest of the month. But even endeavoring to do that, the 3 of us are sitting here. So I mean, that is just the reality. So I would say also to people listening that if you've ever for a second doubted that you have the authority or the know-how or the insight or the intelligence or whatever to talk about something or be a member of something or have leadership in something or write something, please know that there are 10 equally or less qualified men who are jumping at the chance and that you should just do it. And it would make my life as a booker of a podcast also a lot easier. Staying on this cultural point just for a second, but shifting gears a little bit to a different kind of culture. One of the stereotypes of DSA and convention specifically, I think this came out of the last one, is that it's an organization that can't get anything done because there's too much of an emphasis on, let's call it woke politics. And that, there's people who are mad because, there was some scandal about if people were clapping the right way during one of these conventions, or, if there's too much time, this is the stereotype, of course, too much time going around, everyone's saying their pronouns, and now we've gone through the room of 70 people and an hour of the meeting has passed and we've just done that. You mentioned, Philip, at the beginning that one of the agenda items that you weren't able to get on the table was about trans rights and what advocacy is going to be done there. And I'm curious to know why that didn't get on and if there's any there about that. But what would you say, what did some of those kind of like cultural stereotypes come up at this convention? And do you think those stereotypes are overblown and just coming from people who hate, diversity and inclusion and whatever? Or do you think there's like some actual issues there with how these kind of meetings are run?
Well, I think a strength and weakness of DSA is it is a really good expression of the state of the radical left in the US. So it's not all those problems. They're not DSA problems. They're problems that exist in the radical left, challenges and a process development, and DSA very organically expresses it. But a strength of DSA is that since it is a Democratic member-run organization, there's a chance for more of a conscious development and evolution over time. And I think I was quite critical of previous conventions suffering from some of those problems. And I think it was an overwhelming sense of delegates that this convention was significantly more mature, business-like, and a lot of that kind of stuff was a very different dynamic at this convention than previous ones. And I think that is a really healthy development, but that requires an organization where people have tested out and tried different methods of organizing and learned, and with trial and error and with exaggerations and dramas. But overall, the organization as a whole has matured and developed. And I think that's a huge strength. I would also the question of the national campaign on trans and reproductive rights, we moved an amendment, that amendment did pass to add that back onto the agenda. And that campaign was then also overwhelmingly passed later on at the convention. So now we need to actually implement it, and we need to set up a national working group that's going to really do the work of carrying that out. But that was agreed by a supermajority of the convention that we want to have a priority national campaign, and that's a way for DSA to stand out in the 2024 elections as a militant, fighting grassroots organization that's going to fight the Republican right, but on an independent left-wing basis, not the kind of milquetoast approach that the Democrats are putting forward.
Well, to that end, and we'll end on this point, are we going to get the DSA party? Are we going to get, going forward, in an endorsement system that starts to look like the DSA isn't kind of enjoying and taking advantage of the popularity of a few self-described socialists in Congress, and more recruiting, nominating, electing people that have an ideological commitment to certain ideological priors, and are going to make an organization that's going to make endorsement on the basis of a narrower socialist identity than just broadly being on the ideological left. And is that going to start happening in 2024? For example, I know people are going to want to know, okay, AOC can endorse who she wants to endorse. Is there going to be pressure put on the other electeds to endorse somebody else, whether it's Cornel West in the Green Party, whether it's Marianne Williamson or anybody else who might throw their hat in the ring?
I'll say one, DSA is sometimes asymmetrical. It's a big national organization, but most things happen at the chapter level. So I can only really speak to New York, at least. But in New York, we are building that. The Socialists in Office Committee, which I hope anyone listening here Googles it, there's actually quite a few articles. We got to talk about it on the Majority Report. Lots of information out there about what it looks like, how it works practically. I think it's one of the best models for that party-like structure we're talking about. I think the answer is yes, DSA will build that party. It's going to take some time. Even the New York Socialist in Office experiment, I still call it an experiment. It's young, relatively speaking, and it takes an incredible amount of work and organizing, but it's been really successful. And I'll say, to your point about endorsing people with narrower ideologies, I actually really, really believe that the electoral program has to worry a little bit less about a person and more about the structure that backs them. Because we can take someone, we've had some of our electeds here in New York who have been on the left but kind of didn't know a lot, and we turned and molded and organized them into some of the sharpest socialist leaders in the United States right now. And we've taken folks that are kind of new to things. You know, I've been in a union, I haven't thought about socialism before, turned them into like a radical Marxist. That can be done. It can only be done collectively. You know, I know it's kind of annoying. Me and Philip keep talking about the organization, the collective, the structure. How do you spot a DSA member? It's a structure person. But yes, that collective group structure power, that party matters so much more than the individual. You can have the best possible person.
I think you're right.
Worse.
It's showing that there's a value in being a member of this organization and listening to it, because you can either gain or lose that on the ground support, I think is really crucial. And I do think that part of the reason you get some of the antagonism, maybe, let's say, overly broad criticism on the left from the quote unquote Jimmy Dore left, is because absent the ability to demonstrate that you can help someone, all you have is the ability to hurt somebody, right? And I intellectually, I kind of like emotionally understand that. Also, you know, Jimmy Dore's ability, I don't mean to say his name specifically, but the online left's ability to help really was in giving people platforms and stuff, which they availed themselves on in the early days. I think Jimmy Dore and Glenn Greenwald were both, at the Intercept at the time, Glenn were two of the biggest and earliest high-profile interviews that AOC had. And of course, then you had the socialist filmmakers, whose name I'm also blocking. I clearly know the name of this group. I know this group very well. Means TV, thank you. The Means TV guys did the ad for her that went so viral. And so there was this really close relationship between the online left and AOC. But then at a certain point, you're a congressman, you don't need Jimmy Dore. You can go on MSNBC. And I do think that there was this, it almost felt like an acknowledgement that they didn't help you. You know what I mean? Like, it was a lack of acknowledgement of the aid that you got. And so like this instinct to kind of want to withdraw that help. Well, you don't really need me anymore to get on the air, but I can try to damage you among your base. I get it emotionally. So I really hear that. But there's this a little bit of this chicken and the egg situation of, okay, if I can prove that I can help you, maybe you'll listen to me, but I don't want to help you because you've proved that you won't listen to me. And that's where I feel like we're stuck.
Well, I feel very strongly, and I think Philip agrees, that that regardless of how we might feel of, can you help me, will you listen to me, power speaks for itself. I want to become powerful enough that not only are we consulting her on every decision, all our members in office on every decision, but also that they feel like sometimes they don't have a choice to disagree with us. That actually, I have to do the DSA thing because I need them. We want to be so powerful that our electeds need us. And we're creating that here in New York, and it's easier at state level districts. It's a lot harder in the congressional level, but it's ours to build. And I really believe
AOC
in it.
In particular, she's just so popular, and that is a double-edged sword. She could wake up tomorrow and say, actually, I'm a Warren Democrat. I never wanted to endorse Bernie anyway. I got a little soft around the heart attack. That was a mistake. I want to be a senator and I want to be president. And I am no longer a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. I am an FDR Democrat. And let's go fundraise. And there's nothing that we could do to stop her. She would thrive and probably be very successful and be the next Nancy Pelosi. And there's nothing we could do about it. And I don't know, outside of just finding someone with a preternatural commitment to their ideals, or someone who just isn't that powerful. I don't know how you get around that. Unless, yes, you find an organization that is in fact even more powerful than the mighty AOC.
Yes. I mean, I think, I'm not lamenting that she's so powerful, and I don't think she's going to do that. She certainly hasn't done it yet. I'm glad she's so popular, and that's good for us. And I think that conclusion is, we got to grow. We need 500,000 members, 1 million members. If you are listening, this is the power, join DSA. This is the power you get to build with us, because there's no one with that preternatural commitment to their ideals. No one who's that perfect all the time.
What about
us together have to do it.
What about socialist alternative? Was there any discussion at the convention of socialist alternative, Shama Sawant, entryism, people feeling like it's a threat versus people feeling like that's the kind of energy we need to be bringing to the DSA? What's the scuttlebutt dish?
There was no discussion about it at convention. There was a little bit of it in advance, specifically around Kshama Sawant. But, I want to be very kind here. I think they're two very different organizations in size and scale and goals. And I think... how
are the goals different?
Truly, I don't know what's going on in socials. I don't know a lot about Socialist Alternative. I have a few friends here in Queens that are members, and they're also dual members in DSA, and I like them, and I'm glad they're in this org. So I don't know. But we're very different organizations, and I guess, at least for me, they don't come up a lot. So I can't speak to it.
Is it the same for you, Philip? Is that your experience?
Well, I think so. I think Socialist Alternative, they were not present at the convention at all. And I think that was their choice. They had a number of delegates at the 2021 convention, including Shama Sawant was an elected delegate from Seattle at the 2021 convention. But I can say in Seattle, Shama and none of their members ran as delegates. I don't believe they had any delegates at the 2023 convention. So they chose not to participate in this year's convention, which I think is a shame. It gets, maybe just backing up to the previous question, I think the challenge is for DSA to become a political party, a mass socialist party, a working class socialist party, and to change this whole dynamic on the between electeds and right now the sort of norm in U.S. politics is electeds have all the power and they are the decision maker. You have a very it's very much centered around them. I think as socialists we want to build a fundamentally different model based on a mass political party that has democratic control and elected serve as representatives. And I think DSA has great potential to do that. But to answer your question, do I expect that to happen in the short term? I don't. Looking at the results of this convention, I think the convention shows there's promise, there's potential, but we need to build a stronger revolutionary Marxist wing in DSA to make sure that potential is realized. And I think comrades like Socialist Alternative could contribute and help with that if they were to join and be actively part of DSA in building a strong revolutionary Marxist left that can realize that potential for DSA to turn itself into a political party.
Yeah, I'll just say this about this is not democratic, what I'm about to say. This is me trying to use my big podcast influence to influence the agenda of the DSA. However, my subjective feeling is that a lot of the crisis of confidence could be cured by relatively superficial shifts. And that cuts both ways, but that is what it is. And one of those relatively superficial shifts comes in the form of endorsements, because like it or not, and I've been the victim of this, people's perception of how down you are for various candidates, or however much you will be a sop for people who they think are doing sheep herding or whatever into the Democratic Party, is what your kind of integrity in the space is rising and falling on. And I do think that people are deeply frustrated by Bernie's endorsements of Joe Biden, the speed with which he endorsed after he dropped out in 2020, his failure to keep his organizing wing alive, his failure to remain in contact with left media orgs and orgs. And the AOC endorsement felt like a continuation of that sort of betrayal. And at least having an openness and a recognition of the value of people running outside of the Democratic Party, I think goes a long way. I'm not saying that I mandate there should be a DSA endorsement of Cornel West, but I do think that a demonstrated support and of the appreciation of a candidate running outside of the Democratic Party would feel like to a lot of people like
Absolutely
a representation of a commitment to adversarial politics.
So here's the question I want to put back to you, though, Brianna. Will you rejoin and work with me to get DSA to endorse Cornel West?
Yeah, I can do that.
All right. And it DSA, it's the story is unwritten. We get to decide, and we need to build a left wing
Philip,
that fights for it.
Let me tell you, first of all, I am very annoying.
That's
okay,
good.
So there's going to be people.
No troublemakers not.
Can I tell you that the last time I was on my DSA in DC DSA Slack was around Force the Vote, and I had joined up for exactly this reason. I joined the Slack for this reason. I was frustrated that there wasn't a vote that was taken within DSA about Force the Vote. I know that the healthcare caucus had voted. It's a small caucus, so it's not obviously representative of the organization, but it was overwhelmingly in favor of doing Force the Vote. I wanted to know what was going on within the organization. I could only blame myself for not being a participant. So I logged in, I got the Slack, I logged into the Slack, and the first messages I saw were people making fun of me and putting my tweets into the Slack and laughing about me. So I didn't say anything about it. You know, they obviously didn't know I was there yet, but it was not exactly inspiring or especially solidaristic. It wasn't exactly the welcome mat I would have liked. But that was 3 years ago or 2 years ago, whatever. And I am happy to try again. Hashtag not all DSA Slacks.
It's a problem of the whole left. We need to break out of this. We need to develop a culture of a solidaristic, democratic culture of debate, collaboration, not calling people out, but calling people in, trying to clarify issues, not score points. And
I was such a sweetie pie back then. I was so much less visceral.
It doesn't surprise me, but that's the toxic atmosphere that exists, culture that exists outside DSA and too often inside DSA. But we are working we need to actively change that.
All right.
You need to get off Twitter.
I'm down with that. I think, you know, the pandemic and all of those things disrupted a lot of in-person stuff that I might have ordinarily done at that time in the beginning of 2021. But yeah, I think that could be interesting for me. I've been also just honestly, personally feeling a little demoralized, more so even than the post-Bernie malaise, and a little unfocused about what to do next and what this podcast is really about. I've lost some enthusiasm for political commentary, if I'm going to be really honest. And I think that reconnecting in the real world might help to relight my spark. So I'll take you up on that, Philip. Thank you both.
We have stay off Slack, stay off Twitter. Go to the in-person DSA DC chapter meetings. We have a lively chapter in DC.
I'm down. I'm totally down. I take you up on that.
All right.
Thank you both for joining me and giving us some insight into what went on with the convention. I hope you'll come back and be our DSA emissaries going forward. I would love to do a panel with both DSAers and social alternative-ers talking about various strategies and the like, and maybe one or both of you can come back for that as well. Let the audience know where they can find you on the internet, off the internet, and beyond. Let's start with you, Scott.
Well, thanks so much for having us. Actually, thanks to Philip for suggesting that someone from the other side of DSA come on.
Yeah, that was very Minchy of you, Philip, and very helpful.
Yeah, and you know what's funny? If I remember everything that was said today, Philip and I sound like we're in sync. We did not.
It's me you're fighting against. I'm the Jimmy Dore left.
Yeah, we did not sound very far apart at all, which is lovely. Maybe DSA needs more ideological diversity. There's things we disagree about, I promise. But at least today, it was great. I love this kind of comradely space. So thanks so much. Would love to come on again. You can find me, I guess, on Twitter, unfortunately. It's my full Greek name, Stylianos K. But you should look up my cute little podcast. It's a labor of love. It's an attempt, if you find yourself thinking about the left and socialism and DSA, and if anything about DSA at all today has excited you or interested you, it's a great thing to listen to. It's short 30 minutes episodes. Left on Red, like the color. You might need to look it up with my last name or Susan Kang because we're not that big. And there's a lot of Left on Reds online, but look it up, check us out, and join DSA. I really hope you do.
Labor of Love is also a really good left podcast name, I just like to say.
And here I am, 40 episodes in, but that I hope someone listening takes you up on that.
All right. And Philip, where can people find you online and elsewhere?
Again, thank you so much for having us on. It was really great. You can I often write at reformandrevolution.org, and I am on the horrible Twitter app, which is also sort of way too often DSA's members bulletin. And you can find me just Philip Locker on Twitter.
All right. Thank you both. This has been really delightful. Thanks to everyone for listening. If you would like to support more conversations like this, you know you can get an additional episode every week on Mondays at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. I hope you enjoy this weekly free Thursday episode with these great comrades here. And as always, take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.